Well, thanks, Darren, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak here tonight. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I know this is Birders' Night in Vancouver, so my worry was that there'd be nobody here. Everybody had Birders' Night in some church basement elsewhere. So I'm grateful that you chose to come here. As you know, I'm talking tonight about the state of Canada's birds. This is based on a study that came out actually almost 2 years ago now, a year and a half anyways. I've got some updated data that I'll show you as well, but generally the results are pretty much the same. And this study was done through a group called NABC, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, which is it's kind of a coalition of government and non-government associations. The Environment Canada takes a big lead role. Groups such as Nature Canada and Bird Studies Canada, the group that I work part-time for, are also involved. And I didn't have much to do with the writing of the report. That was all done really by the Environment Canada staff, particularly Charles Francis. And although they were using data from programs that I was coordinating, so I was involved at that level. I really became involved, kind of ironically, at the very end when we went to roll this out and present it to the public and to the media. And of course, because it's the federal government, the scientists who wrote the report weren't allowed to speak to the media about it. So I became the spokesman. So I got a quick lesson in the report itself. I read it thoroughly, and so I've been giving talks like this ever since. So what this report is for the past 40 and more years, really for over 100 years, there's been data being collected on the populations of Canada's birds, where they are, how many there are, that sort of thing. But there had never been a one report that took all that data from various surveys that were being done and brought it all together in one place to cover as many of the species as we could as possible in one report. So there's 451 species of birds in Canada. These are the regularly occurring birds that almost all of them nest in Canada on a regular basis. You know, the birders will tell you there's way more than that, of course, but those are the birds that they get excited about, the ones that come from Asia or Europe and shouldn't really be here. But there's 451 or thereabouts species, and when we assembled all the data we could on their populations, we found that there was 327 of those species that we had enough data on. And this is data on population trends more than the actual populations. For some species that are really rare, we have really good ideas of how many birds are out there. You know, I don't know exactly what the number of spotted owls, for instance, now are in Canada, but you could probably count them on the fingers of both hands, or maybe one hand, I don't know. But we don't have very good data on the long-term population trends in spotted owls because we don't know how many there were 40 years ago. So this is more a report on the state of the populations of the common species of birds in Canada. And we have data on about 72% of those species. And for the most part, I'm going to be talking tonight about 40-year trends, because that's when the two main surveys that we have really started collecting good data. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So tonight, I'm going to first talk. The first part of the talk will be more about why birds. You know, why should we be interested in the state of Canada's birds and their populations? Why we can actually say something about that. Then a little bit on how we count these birds, how we keep track of those populations, and finally, of course, the main part of the talk will be what these surveys have told us. So first of all, why birds? Well, some people would go into great length about, how many dollars the birds bring into the Canadian economy. There's so many birders now that, they generate a lot of money. I mean, that's not where I would want to put the emphasis on why we should be interested in birds and the health of their populations. The one, I think, thing that comes down for most people is that birds are a big group of animals out there, and there's, as I said, 451 species. Those species are found in a wide variety of habitats. So if we know something about their populations and how they're doing, we can really say something about the health of those environments, those ecosystems. And that, of course, comes directly to us and the health of our environment. And so we can use these bird populations as kind of surrogates of the health of various ecosystems. And the other part about, why birds is that for all the other kinds of animals out there, we can relate to birds more than we can relate to almost anything else out there in the natural world. Birds are diurnal. They're active during the day like we are. Most mammals are active at night, so we don't see them. Birds live in a visual and oral world. They interact with each other through sight and sound, just like we do. Like I'm talking to you. That's how we communicate. That's how birds communicate. Mammals live in a very different world. They, as I say, they're mostly nocturnal. They rely on, if they do rely on hearing, often in ranges that we can't hear. They rely tremendously on smell, something that we're just really not that good at. I had a colleague when I did my first few years, in fact, I think it was when I was in my undergraduate years here at UBC, there was a guy here, Dave Hawes, I don't know if some people might remember Dave, and he was studying shrews. Shrews are just the archetypal mammal that relies totally on smell. And of course, Dave was studying shrews, and so he claimed, I don't know how true it was, that he could identify a shrew by its smell. He could identify the sex and species of shrews, so he could pick up a trap, before he even looked in it and said, female vagrant or something. I was never one to doubt it and call him on it, but there's very few people that can do that. It's not something you don't have the Vancouver Shrew Watchers Club. You don't have the Shrewers Night in Vancouver, like Birds Night. So birds are, people enjoy watching birds simply because in many ways they're a lot like us. And we can relate to them. And they're very colorful. So they rely on color a lot for their own displays, how they identify each other. So it makes it easy for us to identify them. And so it's kind of a natural fit. And as a result, as I said, we have all these birders out there. And there's more every year, I'm told. It's apparently a really growing segment of the population. There was a study came out a few years ago said there was 50 million birders in North America. Something that I would take issue with. I mean, they're probably not birders that I would identify as birders, but maybe they said these people had field guides. I mean, this was based on a polling, scientific polling. I guess they asked, "Are you interested in watching birds?" And if they said yes, then they multiplied it out and said there was 50 million of them. So that's 1 in 5 people apparently identify themselves as, enjoying watching birds. Most of them are what you would call backyard birders. They just, look out their window, they have their feeders, whatever, but they enjoy watching birds, and it's, important for them. But 3 million of them, and this is kind of amazing to me, 3 million of them actually keep a life list of birds. And that's pretty serious stuff. I mean, I know some pretty keen birders that don't even keep a life list of birds. So that's 1% of the people in North America are serious enough to keep a list of birds. So these people know how to identify birds, they keep track of it. And the upshot of this is that there's a lot of people out there with a lot of talent for identifying birds, a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and they're out there looking at birds all the time. And that's why we can put on these broad-scale bird surveys across North America and the world. These are happening all over the world now. A lot of it was started in Europe and Britain, and North America is kind of catching up in many ways, but we've had them going on for years. Because these birders are out there watching birds, all we have to do is come up with some survey protocols that are easy enough to make it fit in with their birding habits, and but rigorous enough that we get some decent data out of there that we can then use to monitor bird populations or ranges or whatever question we're asking. And there's many of these surveys, but I'm just going to mention a few of the bigger ones here, the ones that we use a lot. The two in yellow, the breeding bird survey and the Christmas bird count, are probably the two surveys that are used most often in producing data like I'm going to talk about tonight. These are surveys that are done all across North America, and I'll talk more in detail in the next couple of slides about them. But we also have breeding bird atlases. We just finished our first breeding bird atlas in British Columbia, where we go out and map the distributions of birds in a province or state, try to estimate the numbers in each part of the province, and then we can go back in 20 years, say, and see how things have changed. British Columbia's a little behind in this. Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, Alberta have already been on their second ones. And so once you do it another second time, you can say really interesting things about the changes in bird numbers. There's special owl surveys, of course, because they don't fit into the protocols of most of the other counts. There's a great thing called eBird, one of the programs I'm in charge of for Canada, where birders can enter their data from any place, any time in the world, and it just goes into a big database, and it's all interactive online, and you can see maps and graphs, and it's just, there's literally millions of these records coming in every week now. We have migration monitoring stations that count birds as they go north or south in the spring or fall. And then these are all added onto by professional surveys, by paid biologists who are out there doing specific counts, mainly for waterfowl, shorebirds, and seabirds. Birds that just aren't counted well by these other methods. So just a little bit more detail on the breeding bird survey, because it's a really important part of the data here tonight. This is a survey that's done all across North America. In Canada, we have 500 routes, more or less, that are done every year. And each route is done by the same person every year. So I've been doing a route that starts in Summerland in the Okanagan. I've been doing it every year since 1973. And so the breeding bird survey is really built on that kind of thing. You try to keep the observer differences down to a minimum. The only thing that happens, of course, as people get older, they start not reporting golden crown kinglets. And so you might think the golden crown kinglets are going extinct, but it's not. So it's a very rigorous survey. I mean, it's designed like you would a normal professional bird biologist would do to go out and census birds in an area. You drive a road, you stop every half mile, you get out, you listen for 3 minutes and write down all the birds you hear. It's mainly done with singing males in the early summer. So it requires two things. It requires a road to drive on that's at least 25 miles long, and it needs a birder who knows all his or her bird songs or bird calls by ear. And that's not everybody. So there's a bit of a crunch comes when you start going north in Canada. You run out of roads and birders fairly quickly, and you can see that line above which we don't have very good data from the bird survey, breeding bird survey. And it was started in the late 60s, but we have pretty good data in Canada from starting about 1970 in eastern Canada and 1973 here in British Columbia. And it's an easy route, it's easy survey to do because you just have to do it once. You have to get up really early. Like my route starts at 4:20, so I have to get up about 3:20 to be there at the start, but it's only one day. The other long time bird count in North America is the Christmas bird count. A lot of you here may have been out on one of those. This was started in 1900 with, I think, 25 counts that were held across North America that year. And now in Canada alone, there's 420 counts. There's about 2,000 counts in the United States. And in Canada, we have 13,000 observers taking part in these. So it's a big effort again. These are done differently. The Christmas count's a bit more of to be honest, the Christmas count was started as a fun social thing. It's a Christmas thing. And for a lot of us, it's just as a part of Christmas as, eating turkeys, going out and counting them. So it's, some people kind of look down on the Christmas count data as not being as good as the other data. But really, we do gather ancillary data to look at effort, and so we try to control for that. And there's just a lot of data out there. And for some species of birds, it works very, very well. And what it does is collect a lot of data on those birds that nested too far north to be counted in the breeding bird survey. Those are the birds in northern Canada that come down in winter in southern Canada and the United States, so they're well covered during the winter. So anyways, what it means is that there's a lot of bird population trend data out there. It's long term. For most of it, we have at least 40 years of data. And for a lot of these species, speaking from someone on, say, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, we wouldn't even start looking at a worrisome trend, and kind of list something as threatened until we had 30 years of good data on it, because you really need that length of time to get over natural fluctuations in bird populations year to year. And these things are done all over the continent, so we can see see what's happening on the Pacific coast versus the Atlantic coast or the prairies. And admittedly, the quality varies by species. Some species just aren't easy to count for various reasons. They're not singing at the right time. They're owls, they hoot at night. Some birds are singing like in February instead of June. So some birds we just don't have very good data on. But compared to other animals, we have tons of bird data. And this is why birds, I think, one of the main reasons birds make a good indicator of ecosystem health is that we have this data. The only other animal group that we have lots of trend data on are the fish, and that has its own problems, just the way it's collected. We can't see fish, they're not out there singing. We have to drag nets through the water in certain places and hope that's where the fish are, and then you're only counting them by killing them, so it has its own issues. But when I served the Cascade, the bird people were always the envy of the rest because we had data and nobody else did. Okay, so that's how we do it and why we do it, and here are some of the results. Overall, some species are doing well. 33% of the birds in Canada are showing good sign of an increasing population over that 40-year period. The downside of that group is that many of those birds are showing a healthy increase simply because their populations had been driven so low by the actions of humans before that, and we'd stopped beating them on the head or whatever we're doing, and so the populations were rebounding. There's a few that were doing fine before and now we're doing really fine, but those are the minority. On average, the populations of Canadian birds have declined by about 12%. And that's an average, averaging each species. It's not like the whole bird bird population of Canada declining by 12%. So the average decline for a bird species in Canada is 12%. But the worrisome, the sort of bad news part of the situation is that 44%, almost half the bird species in Canada are showing significant declines. So there's something in the middle, about 23% that are just cruising along, more or less stable. So this is a graph that teases out some of the groups to show what they're doing. One of the things that we wanted to do with this study was to look at groups of birds, by the habitat they were in, by how they caught their food, by what food they ate, and see if there were patterns that showed some good news or bad news. And as you can see, the graphs, the lines that are going up there, the blue and purple lines at the top, those are the raptors, the waterfowl, the colonial seabirds. So those species all seem to be, on average, doing well. There's species among them that aren't, but as a whole, as a group, they're doing quite well. In the middle, we have things like forest birds and other water birds, things like loons and grebes that are doing okay. And then the three groups that are showing some really serious declines that we should be worried about are the shorebirds, the grassland species, and what we call the aerial insectivores, the birds that fly around and catch bugs in the air. And I'll talk more about all these as we go. But it just shows you there are some good news and bad news in there. So raptors, the hawks, the eagles, falcons, these birds are showing a tremendous increase, 70% average increase over 1970 levels. But these all more or less came after steep declines in the previous 20 years. In the 50s and 60s, most of these birds declined drastically, largely due to the effect of DDT and their derivatives on the birds, but also due to a lot of just willful shooting and persecution that was going on in the early part of the century as well. And just as an example, one of the obvious classic examples here is the bald eagle, which was always fairly common in British Columbia, but even here has been increasing a lot in the last few decades. Here we have, in the center there, the graph is the Breeding Bird Survey Index, which shows 3.3 annual increase over 40 years. Almost over that year, it's almost gone up by 4 times. The Christmas bird count, which the Breeding Bird Survey is only for Canada. The Christmas bird count data is for all of North America, and it's in the United States where the bald eagle has really boomed, and so that line is going up even steeper. It's going up at like 6% a year. So tremendous increase in bald eagles. Another classic example of a good news story in the bird world is the peregrine falcon. When I was just starting out as a young biologist, peregrines were considered very rare, not exactly on the edge of extinction, but they had vanished from the bulk of their range in central North America, everything off the Pacific coast really, and the high Arctic, everything south of the Arctic and east of the Pacific coast. There was hardly any peregrine falcons left. There were certainly none in the interior of British Columbia where I was growing up. And since DDT was banned in the 70s, this species and there was a lot of management action done, of course, to help peregrines along, but after a while a tipping point was reached and they just took off, and really in the last decade or two. And you can see there was a slow increase there till, say, 1990, and then kaboom. This line is for that interior group of peregrines, so this doesn't include the Pacific Coast peregrines, and it doesn't include the Arctic peregrines. The Pacific Coast peregrines, because they were fairly stable through all that period, and the Arctic peregrines we just don't have good data on. But in the interior part of Canada, from the Okanagan east to Newfoundland, that is what this graph shows. So going from basically 0 to almost 500 pairs of birds in literally 20 years is a real big conservation success story. The other group that's really increasing heartily are the waterfowl. And it's a similar story in some ways. This is a case where waterfowl populations had been declining. We knew what the problem was. For the most part, it was habitat loss and overhunting in some cases. So there was, back in the 60s, there was new restrictions put on hunting. There was a huge investment of money and time and effort into wetland conservation and rehabilitation. And basically ducks and geese and swan numbers on the whole have really rebounded tremendously. When you think, again, an example would be trumpeter swans, which I remember my father was really keen on trumpeter swans when I was a kid because we had a few wintering in the Okanagan. And there were just, the number of swans I forget the low numbers that we had in BC, but it was very few wintering here in British Columbia. And then all those efforts paid off, and over the past 40 years, their numbers have just gone through the roof. They've sort of gone from something where people were talking about extinction to being agricultural pests, so things really looking up for trumpeter swans. I won't even mention the words Canada geese, but snow geese are another big success story, etc. A lot of the duck species have bounced right back. There are still some species that are declining, and there's concerns about things like lesser scaup and northern pintail, that there are some issues, and wetlands are still being lost at a great rate, so there's still work to be done. But on the whole, the news around waterfowl has been pretty good. Okay, on to forest birds. This is where it gets a bit muddy because forest birds do a lot of things. There's a lot of different kinds of forests. It was hard for us to group these into meaningful, into groups that would show some meaningful patterns. Some are going up, some going down. Here we have orange-crowned warbler, one of the commonest warbler species here in British Columbia, seems to be doing quite fine, slowly increasing if anything. This is a species, if you know anything about it, that doesn't require old-growth forests. In fact, it loves clear cuts, so that may be why it's doing so well. But it's, some of these forest species are doing fine. Others are declining, and we don't really know why. This is a Cascade Finch, one of the commonest birds in my yard in the Okanagan. In about a month or so, they'll come, hopefully. Last year, they just didn't come at all. So I don't know what's going on there, but their numbers, these finches feed on conifer seeds. Cascade Finch is largely on ponderosa pine seeds, Douglas fir. Other species are more specialized in other conifers. And so their numbers go up and down with the cone and seed crops. So you can see the big spikes in the early days there. What's happened with Cascade finches is that it's hard to get a good idea of there's a lot of variance around in those indexes, but what's happened lately is that those big peaks and valleys have disappeared and the population just seems to be going down steadily, maybe bottoming out now, but there's been something happening with Cascade finch. And another even more striking example of a forest finch is the evening grosbeak. Again, a very distinctive bird. If you have a bird feeder and you're feeding sunflower seeds, my wife used to have a nature store in Penticton back in the 90s, and I think they made most of their profit off of the evening grosbeak just because they're so voracious feeders on sunflower seeds, and sunflower seeds, there's reasonable profit margin in selling sunflower seeds. And so we would pray for the annual arrival of the evening grosbeak. And then they just stopped coming. And so you can see across Canada that line just steadily going down since the 70s. It's a little more complex than that because of the way these trends are analyzed. That line actually goes, when you look at each year, I'm not a statistician and I'm not going to tell you how this was done because I don't understand, but well, it was a Bayesian hierarchical modeling analysis. So there you go. There's some people in the crowd who know what that is. But in reality, that these numbers were fairly high through the 70s and then declined sort of in the late 80s and 90s. And this species, although it's a finch, loves to feed its young spruce budworm caterpillars. And there's 3 species of spruce budworm, and they were all really doing well in Canada in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then, for whatever reason, those caterpillar and moth populations went down, and the evening grosbeak population has gone down too. And for years, people kept telling us in COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, you've got to get a report out on evening grosbeak. And I kept saying, oh, they'll come back. Because they were just going down, and they're so obvious to people. So finally, I see they broke down this year, and they commissioned a report on this, status report on this bird, because population levels are so low. So 86% decline since 1970. But the fact is, they were probably fairly low back in the 40s and 50s and came up again, and what we're seeing is, at least part of the situation is a decline from those high numbers. Another group that seems to be going down throughout the whole group are the shorebirds. Overall, for the species that we have data on, there's been about a 42% decline. This is a group that we don't have as good or consistent data on as we do for some of the other groups because most of them nest in the high Arctic, and it's just not feasible to do surveys up there to get an idea of get a good population estimate on an annual basis anyways up there. They migrate through here in vast numbers, big flocks, so you can go down to Boundary Bay or the Bay of Fundy over in New Brunswick and see big numbers of these shorebirds, and there are programs that count them as they stop over these sites. But it's hard to know whether you're looking at the same proportion of the population every year, or whether they moved, or whether they went by on Wednesday and you came out on Thursday. And so it's hard to get good data on them. We do have some good data on species that winter in very small areas in South America where you can actually go there in winter and see much of the world population or the continental population in one place. But in general, they've been declining, especially these Arctic nesting species, things like buff-breasted sandpipers and red knots in particular. I'll just use red knot as an example because it's one species we do have good numbers on. This is a shorebird that nests in the high Arctic around the world. There's a number of subspecies, 3 that are found in Canada. There's one russellaria, which is the one that breeds in Alaska. We see a few of them here in Roberts Bank and Boundary Bay every year as they're migrating through, and they winter in northern South America, Venezuela, maybe Colombia. But the big Canadian breeding population is the subspecies rufa, which breeds in our high Arctic. Comes down in the summer and stops over in places like James Bay and Delaware Bay, and then ends up almost all the population of rufa winters in Tierra del Fuego, where we can count them. And then there's another subspecies, I think it's the nominate subspecies, Canutus, that breeds in the high Arctic, Ellesmere Island, northern Greenland, and it winters primarily in Holland, where there's real problems because in the places that they winter in, there's a big industry to harvest little tiny clams by just sort of mowing through these mud flats and sifting out the clams, and that's exactly what the knots like to eat. So here we have a lot of the trouble with these shorebirds in general, and knots in particular, are what goes on at these migration stopover sites. These shorebirds are famous for flying hundreds or thousands of kilometers at once without stopping, and then they are just totally out of fat reserves, which is the fuel that they're using when they're flying. So they go to a place like Delaware or Maryland, and they're feeding there in the summer almost exclusively on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. And horseshoe crab numbers have declined dramatically over the past century, largely due to over-harvest. It's used for bait and eel fisheries, and it's used in other things. And because of that, we think, these birds just aren't able to put on the fat necessary to make that long flight down to South America. And the same things are happening with other shorebirds that we have coming down here to Boundary Bay. We have a huge proportion of the world population of western sandpiper stops over in Boundary Bay every year on its way from Alaska down to South America. And so there's a lot of concerns about habitat issues, habitat quality in the Fraser Delta with regard to that species. So these are birds that have very tight requirements, and something going on in one small area can make a huge difference for that whole species. The other sort of habitat-related group that is doing very poorly, really every grassland species is in some sort of trouble. I looked at the data behind all this. There's 45% decline since 1970 in this group. The only species that shows an increase in, I must admit, I don't even believe it, is ferruginous hawk, which shows an increase through breeding bird survey data, but when you actually look at the data gathered by the hawk biologists who go around and count them at their nests, shows some pretty bad decreases certainly in a lot of their range. So as a whole, grassland birds aren't doing very well. And just the poster child here for them is the McCown's longspur. This is a little sparrow-like bird that breeds in the short grass prairies of southeastern Alberta, southwestern Saskatchewan, and down into the United States. 83% decline in McCown's longspurs over the last 40 years. They're only listed as special concern in Canada just because of that big variance. There's a lot of these birds tend to move around a lot in the prairies, looking for areas where the rainfall is just right and the grass is in a certain condition. And so it's a bit harder to get, a tight population trend analysis because they do move around a lot, and so numbers vary from year to year. But they have been declining everywhere throughout their range, and so we're really concerned about them. A lot of the concern with grassland birds, the main theory put forward for their all declines is habitat loss, habitat degradation. These are obviously the easiest habitats for us to alter irrevocably through either plowing to plant grains or pastures, or they're certainly been, if you've ever flown over southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, Wyoming, just the amount of road building that's been going on, amounts of wells that have been drilled for natural gas and oil. There's just a lot of disturbance going on in the last 10, 20 years throughout the grasslands. And that's the idea that brings all these species together and why they're, as a group, declining. And it's not just here in their breeding grounds, it's where they go for the winter. These are birds that the ones that breed in Canada, tend to winter not that far south. They winter in the southern United States and northern Mexico, where similar habitat issues are going on. Another example, and probably for my life, one of the most iconic birds is the western meadowlark. I have to admit, my family home and yard was built on native prairie grassland, and so when I was growing up as a kid, the western meadowlarks were still singing in our orchard because the trees were only this big and they'd been nesting there for centuries when it was just bunch grass prairie. And so I thought of them as our backyard birds, and after I was about 10 years old, they stopped nesting in our yard because the trees were too big, and so they now still only nest south of our yard where there's still native grass. But on the breeding bird survey that I do, you can see that across Canada there's been about a 50% decline over the last 40 years. When I first started doing my breeding bird survey, which back in 1973, I would get about 50 meadowlarks on each survey, and I think this year I got 7. And this is a route where the habitat hasn't changed at all, or at least there's been no development on it. So something's going on somewhere in the meadowlark world. And the last group that is probably suffering the worst declines, but it's a bit of a mystery as to what's going on, are the aerial insectivores. These birds, the only thing we can think of that groups them together is the fact that they all catch bugs in the air. The hard part is that they all catch different kinds of bugs. They're in all sorts of different habitats. They catch bugs in different ways. Some, like the swifts and nighthawks, are just flying high through the air, just scooping up insects as they go along. Others, like the whippoorwills, are sitting on the ground and flying up and catching large beetles and moths and things like that. So it's kind of hard to bring all this together and saying, well, it's a decline. And you'd have to posit that there had been an overall decline in all insects, which is a bit harder to imagine. Maybe it's the case. All these declines tend to have started around the mid-1980s. These birds are, all these birds are kind of common, widespread species. I remember soon after I started working here in 1980, I would be getting phone calls from people who say, what's the matter with the birds this year or something. And right off the bat, in the mid-80s, I was getting regular calls from, where are the swallows? And I would say, some person who just doesn't get out much or something, and maybe their pair of barn swallows that nested under their eaves didn't show up that year, and so they think that this is happening everywhere. And then I started hearing it from bird watchers who were saying, I live on Cortez Island, and we used to have 87 pairs of barn swallows, and now there's 1. And so then you start thinking, boy, something's going on. And when we started really looking at this data 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we started seeing this happen, and there's something's going on with these aerial insectivores. The causes, as I say, there's a lot of theories out there. One of the theories that would bring all that together would be climate change. These birds, the other thing about these aerial insectivore species, they're not just catching bugs in the air. These are the species that go to South America for the winter. We don't have many species that do that. So they're doing long migrations. They're hardwired to start their migration on a certain day. And we always kind of knew that, but now we have data. I think Bridget Stutchbury, one of her postdocs or something, gave this lecture a couple of years ago. And they have, these geolocators on purple martins and thrushes and things like that, wintering down in the Amazon basin. And individuals leave that wintering ground on the same day in subsequent years. Now they're coming back here, and they're coming back to a Canada that is, on average, we'll know what will happen this year, but on average, we're a couple of weeks ahead of where we were 40 years ago in terms of the insect population. The insect population here is just, gets going based on the degree days that they've experienced through the spring. So it gets warmer earlier, the bugs get going earlier, the insects peaks happen earlier, whatever species these birds are feeding on. So perhaps they're just getting out of synchrony with these populations. They've, evolved to migrate on a certain day so that when they're feeding their young, the insects they're feeding on are at their peak numbers, and that they're missing out, and maybe that's why their populations are declining. So just a couple of examples of them. Olive-sided flycatcher, it's not a really common bird, but it's found all across the boreal forest and in the mountain forests of British Columbia, all across Canada and the boreal forest. 77% decline. It's listed as threatened in Canada. It winters in the Andes in South America, and you can see that line, just a steady decline. And that's certainly the case all over North America. Here's something that's doing something else, something different. It catches bugs by sitting on tops of trees and flying out and nabbing them. It's a bird, if you look at its habitat, in Canada, this is a bird that likes forest openings. Theoretically, it should love clear cuts. And it does love clear cuts. It settles in clear cuts very readily. There's some indication from one study that the birds that nest in clear cuts aren't as successful as birds that nest in burns or in openings around lakes, but it's just one study. Maybe that's part of its problem. Or maybe it's, again, part of this migration timing problem. And here's, again, probably the classic surprise that people have been wondering about what's going on with barn swallow. This was, if it's maybe not the commonest bird in North America, but one of the most familiar birds in North America to everybody because it nested on people's houses and barns and outbuildings and garages. People complained because their poop, made their, covered their cars in their garage or their doormats or whatever. And suddenly in the 1980s, they just stopped showing up around. There's still barn swallows around. They're still in some of the higher quality habitats, but there's been a huge decline in them in Canada. But if you look in the United States, they're doing okay, in the southern United States especially. And so there's only been a 12% decline in the United States, and in the southern states, they're just doing fine. So there's something going on there about either the distance they're migrating or where they're wintering. And I think a lot of these questions will become, or the answers will become clear once we get more and more data on where some of our breeding populations are wintering. Because you can't, we'll say, well, barn swallows nest in North America and they winter in South America. But the ones that nest in Mississippi probably winter in Jamaica or something like that. Whereas the ones that nest in Edmonton winter in southern Chile. So they're going to very different places and going longer distances, and it could be a way to tease out some of those questions. And just to sum up with that, as I say, it may not be the fact that these guys are aerial insectivores, it may just be the fact that these are long-distance migrants. You look at some of the data from this study here, the study I'm talking about, the Canadian birds that migrate to the United States, on average, the species have declined 5%. The ones that migrate to Central America and the Caribbean have declined 15% over 40 years. The ones that migrate to South America have declined 60%. So something's going on there. And the ones that don't migrate are only, come down to Vancouver or the Okanagan or Toronto and stay in Canada for the winter, have actually increased on average by 50%. So we're doing okay here, it seems. And just to mention an owl, owls are my sort of favorite things, so I couldn't leave the owls out of it, even though they don't fit into most of our big data packages because they don't show up on the breeding bird survey in particular, and they only show up on certain Christmas counts because Christmas counts, as I say, are fun social things, and sometimes it's hard to convince people to go out at night in the winter and count owls. So there's only certain counts that we get data from. But the western screech owl, when I worked here at UBC, nests out all through the Pacific Spirit Park. I had nest boxes up here, and we had, 2 or 3 pairs nesting in them every year. And I left here in 1995, and towards the last few years I was here, I didn't have any owls nesting in my boxes. I remember going out with one of the local TV crews because they wanted to do some owl thing. And I had a screech owl box there, but just trying to get a screech owl to show itself was getting hard. And if you look at Christmas bird count data now from the southern coast of British Columbia, I think this is from 7 counts that have been going for 40 years on southern Vancouver Island and the lower mainland. And in the red line, you can see that starting the first year there is 1983. They were getting about 1 screech owl per hour of effort. And that sort of bounced around and then just went down to nothing in the 1990s. And you hardly ever see a screech owl around Vancouver anymore. And the green line is barred owls. These are big, obvious owls that just moved into the southern coast here, starting in the 70s, but really establishing themselves and starting to nest, especially around here, around UBC in the 1990s. The count results from those same Christmas counts are just exactly the opposite. Very few in the 80s, and then suddenly in the 90s, the numbers go way up. So there's a circumstantial evidence there that barred owls may be having some effect on screech owls. And certainly the last few times I went looking for screech owls here at UBC, you'd be out there with your tape recorder playing the screech owl call, which I'll try to imitate here. I can't do it when I've been talking too much. But it's this little double trill. And you'd be whistling away there, and then suddenly an owl would fly in and go, yeah, and you'd turn on your light and there'd be a barred owl. And there's a barred owl, looking for breakfast. So you can see why screech owls are disappearing, first of all, and if there are a few left, they may not be willing to show themselves. But it's another species we're very concerned about, and Kasiwik listed it as threatened in Canada recently. So just to wrap up in a different way, this is not in the report really, because, as I said, this report is more about the health of populations in general, mainly the common birds of Canada. We can also look at species at risk, bird species that are at some risk of extinction. So in this calculation, I came up with 5 more, I think, or a few more species of Canadian birds, 466. Of those, 3 are extinct: gray duck, Labrador duck, passenger pigeon. 2 are extirpated; they're not found here anymore. One's the greater prairie chicken, I forget what the other is. And there's some more, so 85 in total. So about 18% of Canada's birds are in some sort of trouble. The Vesper sparrow here is the coastal subspecies of the Vesper sparrow. Found only in one spot in Canada, and that's the Nanaimo Airport. And it's declining rapidly in Washington as well, where the other place is found. So just to wrap up here, for the future of Canada's birds, I think one of the main messages, if there's anything comes out of this talk, is that if we know what's wrong with the bird population or with what's wrong with the environment, and we choose to take action if we have the political will, and we choose to take action, spend the money and time and effort to do something, whether it's banning DDT, whether it's going out there and rehabilitating prairie wetlands, good things will happen. It's kind of a no-brainer. If you decide to take action and you do it, good things will happen. These bird populations and other populations of animals will rebound. But to do that, I think a lot of these other bird populations that are showing signs of trouble, I think we've done the easy things, and now perhaps the things that we have to do now may be a little harder for society to take on, or even scientists. Sometimes we don't know what's really going wrong. But we also need a lot of international cooperative programs. A lot of these species, as you saw from that migration map, don't spend most of the year in Canada. They're only here for a few months. So we have to work with countries in South and Central America, the United States, Mexico, to make these good things happen. We have to take on habitat protection. for instance, with the grasslands. We know grassland birds are in trouble. We know grasslands are diminished and the habitat is decreasing. We should protect grasslands, and there are groups out there that are doing a great job. But then we have government programs. The federal government has all these natural grassland pastures in Saskatchewan that they want to sell off to the highest bidder right now, and it doesn't make sense. It's an easy thing, just to say, forget it, keep things going the way they've been, and at least we won't get any worse. We have to do more long-term land use planning. A lot of these birds are found throughout the boreal forest. It's a habitat that really hasn't been touched that much, or the Arctic tundra. But we have to look to the future and make sure that we protect those areas or manage them in a way that will impact birds and other animals as a minimal way as possible. And we also have to obviously take action on climate change. I mean, it's the one thing, the biggest threat, I think, to our society and to all of the environments, the natural environments of Canada and the world. So that's a short list of things we have to do, and maybe it's a bit harder than banning DDT, but we got to do it. So here's a bit more information if you want to go online. There's a few websites. There's one thing I just mentioned in particular, the status of birds in Canada. It's very similar to the state of Canada's birds, but it's a website that Environment Canada has up where you can go to each species of bird in Canada and see the data, see what we know about them and their population status. So thanks to Ralph Hawken, who took most of those lovely images, and thanks to all the birders who gathered the data. And thank you for coming out tonight.